Welcome to Back to the Text Themselves, a series on phenomenology. Today's video covers sections 59 to 64, the concluding sections of Husserl's Cartesian Meditations. This video marks the last one on Husserl's Cartesian Meditations. In it, we'll consider how phenomenology possibly presents a novel ontology and how it continues to allow for some consideration of metaphysics. Finally, we'll spend some time with Husserl's concluding statements, and I'll add a few of my own. In the concluding sections of this work, Husserl reiterates the purpose of these meditations, which was to demonstrate the concrete possibility of the Cartesian idea philosophy through transcendental phenomenology. To this end, he established the necessary and always employable method of epoche and reduction. Through it, one brackets the existing world that we always already find ourselves within. The method then leads us back to the transcendental ego as the necessary and indubitable starting point of all philosophical thought. This transcendental ego then constitutes itself both in its primordial ownness and in the totality of alienness or foreignness that enters transcendental consciousness. The whole of this self-constituting transcendental ego allows us then to return to a philosophically grounded, objectively existing world and its essential a priori universal structure, which includes nature and culture. In unpacking these insights, we begin with the world, which is then bracketed but ultimately returned to, now grounded in transcendental phenomenology. This coming full circle marks what Husserl calls a new ontology. Ontology entails the philosophical reflection of the nature of being, including the relations among concepts and categories that organize being. The old ontology, as Husserl calls it, derived its concepts in a manner remote from intuition, as in the case of rationalism, or directly from concrete intuition, as in empiricism. Now, the new ontology initially seems closer to empiricism than rationalism because it also draws from concrete intuition, but it dislocates concepts from the natural world and places them into the transcendental. The result of this is that everything naturally given in straightforward intuition is, unlike empiricism, built up again with a new originariness. The notion of the world that we've just described exemplifies this logic of the new ontology, whereas the empiricist would be content with deriving its concepts from nature itself. The phenomenological approach first brackets nature so as to more precisely determine how the natural objective world gets constituted for us in the first place. Empiricism concerns the things of nature, but fails to reflect upon the condition of possibility for apprehending nature as a phenomenon. Later on, in the concluding part of this book, Husserl names this new ontology a universal concrete ontology that in some ways represents a unique synthesis of empiricism and rationalism. Whereas ontology deals with the nature of being and its conceptual infrastructure, metaphysics, often considered a broader branch of philosophy, inquires into the matter of first principles and the fundamental nature of reality. Husserl claims that the results of his analyses are metaphysical only if metaphysics is equated with the fundamental cognitions of being. However, there are no speculative excesses that characterize some of the traditional kinds of metaphysical inquiries. The principal metaphysical conclusions that are drawn from this phenomenology of Husserl is that the ego is the only thing given to me and posited as existing apodictically. A second major metaphysical implication here is the category of the world and the question of whether there is only one world or many. Now, let's recall that I only become a world experiencing ego once I'm in communion with others like me, forming what Husserl calls a community of monads. He then asks if it is possible for there to be separate pluralities of monads not in communion with one another. And if so, would it then be possible to posit that there is more than one world? Husserl indicates this would be an absurd conclusion. Indeed, each group has its unique view of the world, but this only concerns the surrounding world and not the single objective world common to all. all unique surrounding worlds are but aspects of this one objective world. Furthermore, it is in principle impossible for one to truly consider the possibility, since for me to even ask the question regarding different communities presupposes that I must in some manner already be in communion with both of them. Furthermore, to put them in some kind of contrasting relation with one another necessarily presupposes some common ground wherein their differences can make sense to us. As such, although phenomenology excludes what he calls a naive metaphysics with its speculative excesses, he does not believe phenomenology must leave metaphysics behind completely, nor stop asking some of the ultimate questions, those concerning problems of meaning and what he calls ethico-religious problems. The first question of all would be concerning the intrinsically first being that precedes and bears every worldly objectivity, the being before all beings. Although it might sound like he could be evoking God here, and we'll get back into this at the end of the video, he does in fact go on to identify this first being with transcendental intersubjectivity. And it's within this communal sphere all other supreme metaphysical questions are raised. Now, it's not entirely clear to me at this point why he makes this move, and he certainly doesn't justify the statement here. If I was to hazard a guess, it might seem that relational being is the condition of possibility for inquiry into all other kinds of beings, since it is the precondition of having a world at all wherein any other inquiries can take place. Husserl concludes this work stating that what he's done here is only sketch the first stage of phenomenology, leaving fairly undeveloped the apodictic knowledge of a genuine science grounded in an absolute foundation. Again, this is the ideal that phenomenology is aiming after, and we have to posit it as an ideal to motivate the practice of phenomenology, according to Husserl, but it may not be something that can be practically actualized. He also reiterates that phenomenology is first and foremost a radically all-embracing self-investigation that begins with my transcendental consciousness. And if we recall the first video, I become the beginning philosopher. And then it moves on to transcendental intersubjectivity. Even as we come to find that transcendental intersubjectivity is actually more fundamental, but we have to build that back up. Husserl's last line of the text quotes Augustine, "Do not wish to go out. Go back into yourself. Truth dwells in the inner man." Now, for Augustine, the inner man is the place where the soul communes with God. And there are some intriguing parallels between Augustine's inner man and Husserl's transcendental ego, the latter consisting of a sphere of primordial ownness, perhaps something like a soul, and this totality of otherness, which may be considered something like God, even though it's also the basis for transcendental intersubjectivity. Do the theological connotations of Augustine's thought have any bearing here for Husserl? Does this quote in some way connect with the earlier mentioned question concerning the first ultimate being, which he identifies with transcendental intersubjectivity? In a text by Husserl that went unpublished in his lifetime, he wrote that this ideal of the concretely constituting transcendental subjectivity is the idea of a temporally absolutely perfect intersubjective community, one that lies entirely in infinity. Considering these statements and others found in the unpublished works of Husserl, it would seem that Husserl, at the end of these Cartesian meditations, may have been alluding to some kind of inner communion between ego and other that is not fully reducible to the human plane, but has something of the divine implicated. And strictly from a historical philosophical consideration, this would mean that the work entitled The Cartesian Meditations is in fact living up to its namesake even more than Husserl admits. For like Descartes, though in a far more understated fashion for Husserl, Husserl seems to find something like Descartes' notion of the idea of infinity within transcendental consciousness. Now, whether intended by Husserl or not, numerous religious philosophers will pick up on the theological and religious implications of Husserl's thought, leading to a fairly robust tradition that brings together religion and phenomenology. And overall, I was quite impressed by the nuance in Husserl's thought and how many present tributaries of continental philosophy find some of their source in the thinking of this philosopher. A philosopher, to be quite honest, is rarely read nowadays, except for scholars. Admittedly, I resisted reading Husserl for a long time myself, and was even tempted to skip over him to move straight from Heidegger to Sartre in a video series focused on phenomenology. Now, doing so would have certainly been far more beneficial to this channel's analytics. Nonetheless, I'm glad I didn't skip over him, as going through this process will only enrich our understanding of those phenomenological texts to follow in the series, that beginning with Sartre's Being and Nothingness. If you found this video helpful and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below this video. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter of this channel, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also support this work by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. I look forward to seeing you next time when we begin to cover the introduction to being and nothingness. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.